We use the term culture in our everyday. Ethnic culture, digital culture, cancel culture. But what does culture even mean? And how can we go about accessing culture through research? My name is Shatman, and welcome to a new series by the Cultural Research Center where we discuss all things in culture. This is Professor Audrey Yue. She is the head of Department for Communications and New Media at NUS, and as the founder of the Cultural Research Center, she is the perfect person to introduce us to this field of study. We'll start off with the most basic question, which is, what is cultural research?
So we can call cultural research a form of engaged scholarship in action. Cultural research then is characterized by, really an interest in the world, okay, where our research problems are generated from outside non-academic context, the concrete world out there that we live in the context of our social life and experience. If you sort of think back a little bit more, what is the kind of fundamental nature of cultural studies kind of research at the university, at the very basic, we start to teach students textual analysis, right? So on the one hand, text-based research, when we look at films, when we look at books, when we look at music and popular culture, text-based research is, on the one hand, textual analysis. It invokes critical discourse analysis, but we need to think beyond that, to think of text-based research as a kind of an apprentice that involves training basic literacies, not just training basic literacies in identifying genres, in analyzing rhetoric, but training literacies in providing for a socially engaged and socially critical professionalism. So in this way, when we think about cultural research in this way, scholarship is actually actively linked to activism. Scholarship is actively linked to social engagement and social relevance in a new kind of a context.
So you've talked a lot about the textual analysis, such as with like film or music, theater. So what are the kind of primary preoccupations that you've had in your own cultural research?
So my primary preoccupation in cultural research right now is to find a vocabulary to talk about cultural research in Singapore. So cultural research in Singapore has a few genealogies, one of which we can say an official imagination of what constitutes culture. Many scholars have written on that, including Lily Kong, Terence Chong, and many others. So what we call the governmental framing of culture. And the other way to think about cultural research in Singapore is the institutional framing of cultural studies. So with that, that's how we start to think of that as cultural studies as a discipline and as a field of study in Singapore. The third way to think about cultural research in Singapore, or the project of cultural studies in Singapore, is to think outside of the governmental framing of culture, outside of the institutional framing of culture, and to think about culture in the context of everyday life. In the context of culture wars on race, gender, and sexuality, we see the politics of culture emerging as an urgent platform to intervene in, to expose, and to address, and to bring justice in order to rethink the way we allocate resources, the way we allocate agencies, and the way we recalibrate power structures and relationships.
You talk a lot about how cultural research can take different forms, and how the understanding of culture can take different forms as well, from the government to the institution in academia to the everyday life. And on that point of the everyday life, so what do you think that we as people in the everyday, what can we take away from cultural research, and how can we apply the understandings of cultural research to understand our world a bit better?
Central to cultural studies is always about exposing power relationships. So I think in the everyday life context, people can actually think through unequal power relationships to be more self-reflexive about one's own subject position and to be more self-critical about one's own privilege. You know, cultural studies also has always been preoccupied with the practice of resistance. So I think with resistance, we need to also think through the what I call in my own work as the kind of practices of survival that can be opened up in the creative space of resistance. And if those practices of survival are practices that are complicit with top-down policies, I think that we need to find the vocabulary to open up those nuances of enactment, those nuances of encounter, and those nuances of performance in order to bring more complexity into the workings of power, into the workings of how the complexity of power has come to shape contemporary everyday life.
Thank you so much for watching the first episode of In Culture. Leave it a like, leave it a comment, and be sure to continue following us for more conversations with different academics, different artists, and different activists as we continue to talk to them about culture.